Welcome, everybody. Good evening. I'm gonna give folks 1 minute to trickle in, and then I'm gonna get us started because we have a very lengthy agenda and we have a lot of great folks here tonight to speak with you. So I want to make sure we have enough time for folks. And just so everybody is aware, we are recording tonight's webinar. And so if you miss anything or if you want to reference anything back, you will have that resource readily available tomorrow. Great. Well, without any further ado, thank you all so much for being here tonight. My name is Anna. I am a West Slope organizer with Conservation Colorado. And, it's really, I just always like to start the night by saying thank you for taking the time to be here. It's always really great to see just how many folks care about water and care about protecting our very precious resource here in our state. So thank you again for taking the time and being here. As I mentioned, we have a great set of speakers tonight. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to our interpreter first, so folks can have that accessible and listen to this in whatever language they would rather. And so after he introduces himself and just how the interpretation will work, our Conservation Colorado CEO, Kelly Nordini, is going to get us started. So thank you so much, Isao. I will pass it on to you.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Isao. I'm with the Community Language Cooperative. I'm here to create a space for language justice where people can connect with the language of their hearts. We will be using simultaneous interpretation. So when I'm finished with this message in Spanish, we will turn on interpretation services. You can access them by clicking on the globe or on the three dots that say more. Even if the event is predominantly in one language, please select the language of your preference to access English interpretation if questions or comments are made in a different language. You can also select the mute original audio if you don't want to hear both languages at the same time. Muy buenas noches a todos. Mi nombre es Isao. Estoy con la Cooperativa de Lenguaje Comunitario. Estamos aquí para crear un espacio de justicia de lenguaje donde creemos que la gente se puede conectar verdaderamente cuando se relaciona con el lenguaje de su corazón. Hoy vamos a tener interpretación simultánea, entonces cuando termine este mensaje vamos a hacer el servicio disponible para que usted seleccione el lenguaje de su preferencia. Si usted quiere también puede seleccionar la opción de silenciar el audio original para que no escuche a ambos idiomas al mismo tiempo. Thank you very much. We can go ahead and get started.
All right, welcome everybody. We're so glad to have such a great group with us tonight. Thank you for taking a little bit of time to talk about something near and dear to us here in the West, which is our water. I want to thank our legislative champs who you are going to hear from tonight. Speaker of the House, Julie McCluskie, Chair of the House Natural Resources Committee, Representative Karen McCormick, and then also an important player on the legislation, but couldn't be with us tonight, is Chair of the Senate Natural Resources Committee, Senator Dylan Roberts. So their leadership ensured that when the Trump Supreme Court rolled back our water protections, Colorado stepped up and is about to hopefully enact a very strong program to make sure that we step in as a state to protect the water that we love when the feds have stepped back and rolled back protections. And that only happened due to the Speaker and Representative McCormick's leadership. And our plan here is to set an example that other states will follow. And we are this close to getting that done, but we need your help. So I'm going to turn it over to Speaker McCluskie to provide a few remarks, and then we'll hear from Representative McCormick.
Oh, Kelly, I hope everyone can hear me. I am so delighted to be with all of you today. And first of all, a shout out, Kelly, to you, to your team. Our partnership these last few years in a dedication to our natural resources, especially water, has proven to be magical because we've delivered on some very big policy and so grateful to Conservation Colorado and all of the public who is joining us tonight. This is where it happens, and really proud to be a part of this team. I am very excited to be with all of you and talk for just a moment about what happened to us in 2023 when the Sackett decision came down, and we realized instantly that our beautiful streams, wetlands, and lakes were at risk. And over the course of that year, from 23 to 24, we worked hard, tirelessly, with so many stakeholders to bring forward a policy that was truly Colorado's vision of protecting all Colorado waters. It happened with my fellow legislators, our agencies, and groups from agriculture, conservation, local governments, leaders from our business community. It was important to everyone, and I'm so proud that we delivered what we did. But this bill passed in part because the public engaged and came along with us. We know that our public values and prioritizes this, our water resource, our most critical of all resources. And it is important now more than ever that our public step up with us and join us in a process of rulemaking, which will be happening around Regulation 87. While we may have put into policy an intention to protect all of Colorado's waters, a commitment on a process that was fair to industry, fair to our local governments, a process that I believe carefully crafted to protect the Colorado way of life. In the end, when we get to the rulemaking and regulation work, that's really where the rubber meets the road, where our legislative intent is turned into reality. And I hope that many of you will consider and participate in next steps, helping to advocate for the legislation that we've passed and making sure that we continue to protect all of Colorado's waters for the future. I do want to emphasize that this program really focused on predictability, efficiencies for project applicants, while still maintaining strong environmental standards. There's flexibility and adaptation over time so that the state can respond to emerging sciences, technologies, and dealing with climate change as it continues to impact our great state. It is my hope that at tonight's conclusion, not only will you engage in the next steps for this rulemaking, but you will stay partners to all of us down at the legislature. We're only as good as the public we represent, who need to let us know what are their priorities, what are their hopes, what do they see as challenges. So please be sure to reach out to me anytime. And now I would like to introduce the chair of our water committee, probably one of my most favorite committees in the House, a woman who has shown up time and time again to stand up for natural resources, water, agriculture, all that is right for our great state, and a very dedicated public servant, one of the best I know, Representative McCormick.
Speaker McCluskie, and hello everyone that's on the call tonight. It is such an honor. It was such an honor to work this bill through the process with my speaker. We actually worked incredibly hard, but also had fun doing it. So I want to also thank you, Kelly, and all the team of COCO, and actually all the experts on this call. It's so good to see you again. You were a big part of the success of this bill. I want to again repeat the importance of public interaction in the rulemaking process. And as mentioned, I am chair of the House Natural Resources Committee. I'm concerned about this prolonged drought that we're in. It's not only over 20 years old, it's one of the biggest droughts we've ever seen in hundreds of years. And the work that we did to pass this bill was based on real science, science-based policy, and incredible cooperation to show that we can deliver where and when the federal government and their uncertainty left big gaps, especially for Western water needs. This bill includes a very streamlined permitting process for some of the low impact projects that we see. So both infrastructure type projects and well restoration projects can proceed without a lot of red tape, which is really important to keep things moving. The law also encourages voluntary stream and wetland restoration, which is important to support on the ground efforts that increase our climate and drought resilience, which we continue to see getting worse. We're all still waiting for it to rain tonight. It also aligns with Colorado's broader vision for these healthy watersheds that are part of our natural infrastructure here in our state and across the West, so critical for flood mitigation, for our water security, and important for our wildlife habitat, of course. So as you hear from many of the speakers tonight, this is a very complicated issue, and I'm certainly not the expert. They are, but it's complicated also because of the fact that Congress never fully took action to define what is and is not federally protected waters. And I think even just this week, there was a proposed WOTUS rule that does not align with water in the West. So it's really important that Colorado does get this right. This bill was, the huge first step. The rulemaking is the next step. And it represents a really great compromise amongst the hundreds of stakeholders that were involved in this process. And that's what makes good public policy that can last into the future, and how we as Colorado can be a model for other states to look at this particular bill and how the rulemaking process progresses. So at the risk of being repetitive, I just can't overstate what Speaker McCluskie said. It's important to continue to have the public speak up and to participate in the upcoming Water Quality Commission rulemaking process to make sure that your point of view is heard. They do listen, so do participate. And we just want to make sure that our legislative intent and the intent of all the stakeholders involved remains true in the rulemaking process. We want to protect all of our state waters and wetlands. So to keep that on course through this rulemaking process. I am so thankful that we passed this bill. And again, thank you for all of you that are participating tonight and will help us in the rulemaking process. And I'll pass it back to Anna.
Thank you, Representative McCormick. You were a great champ, and we just really appreciate your commitment and your heart and your passion and smarts in all of this. So thank you again. All right. As we said, the key thing here is for Colorado to stay the course and get this over the finish line so we can set a national model. We need all of you for that. So I am going to turn it to Anna to tell us a little bit more.
Thank you, Kelly. Really appreciate it. And big thank you again to Speaker McCluskie and Representative McCormick for all of their leadership, not just for taking the time today, which we do really appreciate, but all their leadership throughout this process, stepping up in these challenging times when one of our, it's been said already tonight, one of our best and most important resources here in the West was threatened. So really appreciate that. Okay, so I am now going to move us along onto our next segment of the event tonight. And just to let folks know, we are going to have an opportunity to do questions and have a Q&A section after we hear from our speakers tonight. So just as a reminder, if you already have questions, if things start coming up as you listen to our speakers tonight, please feel free to add your questions on the Q&A chat, and we will do our best to get through as many as we can. And in the spirit of that, just want to really encourage folks to try and keep it to this topic that we're here to discuss, which is wetlands and streams protection. I know it can be a little bit tricky with the state of our world, but just wanted to say that and encourage folks to keep us on track so that we can get through as many of your questions as we can. With that in mind, we have some incredible water experts with us tonight. So I will go ahead and briefly introduce them and then pass it over to them. We have Jennifer Peters, who is a water policy advisor for Clean Water Action. We also have Josh Kuhn, who is Conservation Colorado's advocacy director, and Stu Gillespie, who is a senior supervising attorney for Earthjustice. And Jennifer, Josh, Stu, I'll let you all take it away.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Peters. I'm Water Policy Advisor for Clean Water Action. And I'm going to give a brief overview of the Clean Water Act. I'm also going to discuss how this landmark law has been weakened and also talk about why Colorado needs its own program to protect wetlands and streams. So the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972 with overwhelming bipartisan support. The main goal of the law is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And to achieve this goal, it directed the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to establish a suite of pollution control, prevention, and cleanup programs. So, as a part of this, EPA also set a minimum floor of protections that states must implement and enforce. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. And so, states have a vital role in implementing the law. And another important thing that's very powerful about the Clean Water Act is that it doesn't just empower EPA and the states to protect our waters. It also allows for impacted citizens to bring lawsuits against those responsible for illegal pollution. The law also enables citizens to sue the EPA for failing to carry out its responsibilities under the law. Next slide, please. So why does waters of the U.S. matter? So the Clean Water Act's pollution control, prevention, and cleanup programs only apply to water bodies that are considered waters of the United States. And that's just a wonky term that describes the scope of waters protected under the Act. So you might be wondering what these programs cover. Well, companies one example is companies that store oil in large quantities near protected waters. They must develop spill prevention and response plans. Developers seeking to bulldoze wetlands or small streams must minimize the harm to the ecosystem and often must create or preserve other similar resources in the watershed to offset their impacts. Sewage treatment facilities like Metro Wastewater here in Denver or industrial facilities like the Suncor oil refinery in Commerce City, they must limit the amount of pollution they discharge into rivers or streams. And there are many more similar requirements. Those are just a few examples. And because water quality depends on what's protected under the Act, back in 1972, Congress intended for this term to be interpreted broadly. They recognized that all bodies of water in a watershed are connected, that the health of the rivers and large streams directly depend on the health of wetlands and smaller streams. But unfortunately, polluters looking to avoid clean water obligations want fewer water bodies to be covered. And for decades, the Act has been under attack from these polluters and the developers who would like to limit the regulatory scope of the Act. Next slide. So in May of 2023, the US Supreme Court drastically narrowed the scope of the Act by ruling that it only protects what are called relatively permanent bodies of water and the wetlands and streams that have a continuous surface connection to other protected waters. And this decision was the largest setback for water protections in the 50-year history of the Act. And the court did this by ignoring science and legal precedents. They eliminated long-standing protections for millions of wetlands and thousands of stream miles across the country. though this court decision was the largest setback for water protections in the history of the Act, it wasn't the first time polluters succeeded in narrowing the scope of the Act. Corporate polluters, developers, and their government allies have attacked the Clean Water Act for decades, and they still are. Just this week, the Trump administration released a proposal that would further gut protections for wetlands and streams. So, with our federal government no longer protecting many streams and wetlands, it's up to states like Colorado to decide how to protect these resources. Next slide. So why do wetlands and streams matter? Well, wetlands perform many important ecological functions in our watersheds, everything from water storage to wildlife habitat. One of their critical functions is the role wetlands have in providing clean water. Wetland vegetation acts as a filter or a sponge for water and sediment that may contain heavy metals, pesticides, fertilizers, other contaminants. Many Colorado wetlands also provide water storage during floods. They buffer our ag lands, cities, and towns from flood damage. Next slide. Ephemeral streams are streams that only flow after it rains or snows, but these are critical to the health of our larger river ecosystems. Here in the West, ephemeral streams on average may only flow for 4 to 46 days per year, but they can contribute up to 79% of the downstream river flow, which, so they're vital for, resupplying our water supplies for drinking and recreation and agriculture. Next slide. So just real briefly, what's at stake in Colorado? So without a new state program, our wetlands and streams are vulnerable to being bulldozed or filled in. And also, not only are these resources at risk, but as I mentioned earlier, they have a direct impact on our overall river and watershed health. So all the water bodies in Colorado are threatened if these wetlands and streams are not protected. 2/3 of our streams don't flow year-round in the state. Next slide. A large percentage of our wetlands lack a direct surface connection to waters that flow year-round. So in conclusion, we need to ensure that all of our state waters are protected because streams and wetlands directly affect our drinking water supplies, recreation, agriculture, wildlife. Thank you, and I'll pass it on to Josh.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Josh Kuhn, Advocacy Director with Conservation Colorado. And thanks for teeing up the background, Jennifer, so that everybody has an understanding of how we got here today. And the answer to this question is, why is this important to Colorado? Jennifer largely answered that, but also there is a rulemaking that is underway right now, and there's opportunity for a public comment on December 8th. And so we are hoping that tonight you will take the information that you have learned and then sign up to provide public comment at that hearing so that you can help us protect these incredibly valuable resources, our wetlands and streams that have lost protections, and that industry is working to weaken those protections. So a little bit more about the background. As folks probably know, we are in the worst drought in over 1,200 years or recorded history. So we need to be doing absolutely everything we can to be protecting our limited water supply. And when we think about our water supply, I know my kids think it comes from the faucet, and that's not true. Well, I guess it comes from the faucet, but it comes from the reservoirs that store our water. But really, it comes from the forest and the mountains where snow falls and collects, and then it melts. And when it melts, it travels through these streams, these seasonal streams, and then it enters into our reservoirs and into the infrastructure that comes into our homes. The problem is that those places, those wetlands and streams way up high in the forest and in the mountains, are the exact places that lost protection because of the Supreme Court's decision and trumps EPA, which is proposing to remove protections again for those types of waters and expand it. So again, you have the opportunity to help us in Colorado set an example for restoring those protections. As folks may know, Colorado is a headwater state. So that means that all of the rivers, for the most part, that are in Colorado start in Colorado. There's three that start outside of Colorado, but we don't have to get there. And so what is really important is that we take care of the water that starts in our state because there's tens and tens of millions of people, both on the west and the east and south of us, who are dependent upon the water that originates here in Colorado. But also, wildlife are dependent upon these wetlands and streams. Nearly 80% of the state's wildlife depend upon wetlands at a certain point in their life. So when I was growing up in the Southeast, we called these places swamps, and I thought they were terrible places and really buggy. And the last thing I ever thought I would be doing is trying to protect places like that. But these wetlands, also known as swamps, are incredibly important for wildlife habitat, but they also help strengthen resilience, as Jennifer mentioned, to wildfires, to drought, and to floods. So these wetlands act as sponges in a certain regard. So what happens is they'll dry out, but then they will absorb the runoff that happens during the snowmelt and slowly release that water throughout the year so that in the drier months of the year, there is a continuous flow of water throughout the system. But also, these wetlands help reduce the severity of wildfire. There's actually a really great photo of the Cameron Peak fire where there's a wetland that's surrounded by the burn scar, but that wetland is still really green, and that's a great visual image to understand that that wetland has so much moisture in it that when a wildfire comes through, it can help reduce the severity of that wildfire. They can also help mitigate floods because they act like sponges again, and they can absorb that water that's flowing through the landscape and help reduce the impacts of floods. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a really, really busy slide. I know, but my point is to help you understand the process and the journey for how we get to the rulemaking that is happening now. And so way back in 2020, during the first Trump administration, there was a proposal to again remove or reduce Clean Water Act protections. That was called the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. And Colorado stakeholders got together to say if that rule is going to be implemented, it's going to severely impact Colorado. So we need to be doing something about it. And so that's what you see on this very busy slide is that the stakeholder process, the process of meeting with folks to figure out what Colorado should do, started way back in 2020. And there were meetings that happened on a monthly basis. They actually ramped up to a weekly basis at a certain point in time. And so it's really important to know that there was just hundreds, if not more, of conversations around this issue that have been happening starting from 2020, moving forward to now. Next slide, please. Again, another busy slide, but I just want you to see that in 2022, there are more discussions that happened because the Supreme Court took up the case to decide whether or not they were going to make a ruling that would further reduce protections on our water supply. And so Governor Polis assembled a task force to study this issue. And so I was able to be a part of that along with other members of the conservation community, but there were members from the state's agricultural industry, cities and towns, from oil and gas to mining to water providers. Maybe I'm forgetting a few other stakeholders, but the idea was to get key stakeholders together, to get key people around the table to talk about what should Colorado do, if anything at all. There were some people that are like, Colorado shouldn't do anything, but fortunately that wasn't the majority of people. And in fact, there was a majority of folks who did agree that Colorado would need to do something if the Supreme Court was going to rule in a manner that significantly reduced protections for our water supply, because these streams and wetlands are so important that there was, again, a majority decision to figure out some way to move forward, restoring those protections. So that task force met all the way up until the decision and then after the decision as well. And so I want to show you something on this next slide that helps illustrate the type of protections that were lost. So you can see in the blue circle, that is something called state waters. Colorado has a definition for state waters, which is any and all waters contained and flowing through the state. So that's virtually just like all waters in the state. The green circle represents, before the Supreme Court's decision, the amount of waters that were protected under the federal government. And so when I say protected, what I mean is that if an activity is going to occur on those waters, it's not that the activity is disallowed, it's that the activity needs to have a review process and then a permit and for the conditions in which that activity can occur. And it works, the permit aims to first avoid impacts to that water body. Second, it tries to minimize those impacts. And then third, if it's deemed needed, to then mitigate or restore the functions of that water body that were lost. So that's what we're talking about. And that's what was happening in that larger green circle. However, after the Supreme Court decision, that circle shrunk and it got smaller. And so then the perimeter increased. And so then that means the state was going to be responsible for providing an greater protection for an increased amount of area. And so that's what we were trying to figure out, is what does the program look like for the state to, again, take an analysis over the types of projects that were going to occur on those water bodies. So hopefully that makes sense to you all. But that illustration really has helped me understand kind of the scope of the water bodies that have been lost here in Colorado. Unfortunately, because of Trump's proposal this week, that white area is going to get smaller and smaller, and that green area is going to absorb more of that white area, where the state is going to provide oversight. And Stu is going to talk a little bit more about the details of what that looks like. But next slide. So a little bit more to help you better understand the process of setting up this program. It's called Regulation 87. It's the regulation that's being developed for how that program is going to work, which is going to be administered by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, also known as CDPHE. So meetings started in September of 2024. The bill that was signed into law was signed in May of 2024. So there was a very short amount of time in between when this process started and when the legislative process ended. And during that time of September 2024, a lot of education was done by the public health department to make sure that folks really had a foundation of understanding of what this program was about. Then there were monthly meetings with interested folks who were going to be impacted by this permitting program, and members of the conservation community as well, so that we could have conversations and ask questions and have presentations about the regulation and the rules of this program. There was also opportunity for those who are interested to provide written feedback on pretty much a monthly basis. So that kept us really busy, but it was an opportunity to go back and forth around like what we thought would work and wouldn't work. And that was really, really helpful to allow us to express our concerns and to also highlight what we thought were really good ideas to restore protections for these places. So really my hat's off to the folks at the Public Health Department for running a great process to getting us where we are today. It's been a ton of work, but we, have gotten the regulations in a good spot, but more work is needed. So I can't remember. That might be my last slide. Nope, a little bit more. So there's a lot of attention on this. There's 40 different entities who are participating. And that the hearing, I mentioned this earlier, is coming up on December 8th through the 10th. So it's a 3-day hearing. Generally, the hearings are like 1 day or half a day. So that just kind of highlights how many people are participating, how many entities are participating, and how much there is to discuss. Next slide. So that's it for me. Now I'm going to hand it over to Stu Gillespie, who has been working tirelessly as a super strong advocate for our wetlands and streams. So Stu, take it over.
Great. Thank you, Josh. And thank you everyone for making time this evening on what's just a crucial topic that's really timely given the rollback of Clean Water Act protections. I'm a supervising attorney at Earthjustice, and I'm representing a number of groups in the rulemaking process, including Conservation Colorado. Just want to back up a second and kind of walk through some of the information we've heard. So what's great is the good news here is that the state of Colorado, thanks to Speaker McCluskie, Representative McCormick, Senator Roberts, they passed comprehensive legislation to develop a dredge and fill program in Colorado that's going to protect our waters, our state waters. And that's important because our waters are our most important asset. They fuel our economy, they protect our health, they're really crucial to our way of life. We're now going through the rulemaking process to implement that legislation. This is kind of where we work out the details. I think Speaker McCluskie put it nicely by saying this is where the law becomes reality. And it's very true. And what's really important is that the rulemaking has to comply with the legislation. So that legislation, it set out directives and requirements that need to be included in the rule. And now we're going through that process to include those details and effectuate the program so that everyone knows what they have to do to protect our waters, or when they're going to get a permit, what they need to do to get a permit. As part of the rulemaking process, there's an opportunity for the public to engage. And I just want to highlight some of the key dates here. So all of you, any of you, can submit public comments up until November 26th. And you can email those to the Colorado Department of Public Health. And hopefully we can put in the chat the email for that, or I can do it after I've finished speaking. As Josh mentioned, there's also an opportunity on December 8th to provide oral testimony at the hearing itself in front of the commission. So those are key opportunities. It's really important to get our voices heard. As Josh mentioned, there's 40 parties in this rulemaking. The vast majority of them are from industry. And so it's creating somewhat of an echo chamber where the commission might just hear their views on how to roll back protections, where we need to be in there emphasizing the importance of protecting these waters. So kind of what I want to do in 5 minutes is kind of give you some ideas about what you could focus in on in your comments if you have time to do that. And I think there's 3 main issues here to think about. And we've heard this through the presentations from Jennifer and from Josh. The first main issue is the scope of the program. What is covered? What's protected? And we know what's protected from the legislation. As I said, it set up a comprehensive program to protect all state waters, including wetlands, and it only has limited exclusions and exemptions. And that comprehensive approach is crucial because all our waters are interconnected. So when you think about a watershed, you have your headwater streams, your headwater wetlands that all connect into larger tributaries that flow down into rivers. And so we have to protect all of those components to make sure that it works, to make sure that the water is being filtered, that it's clean, to make sure that those flood flows are not coming down and flooding our communities, but rather retained in wetlands. So when you go into those comments, that's got to be the top line. We need to have a comprehensive program because without that, we're not going to be able to protect these watersheds, and we can no longer depend on the federal government. As Jennifer pointed out, SACIT was a huge rollback of federal protections, and we're seeing continued efforts to roll back and weaken federal protections. There's really no safety net here at the federal level anymore. The most recent proposal earlier this week, under that approach that the federal government's proposing, only 3% of Colorado's wetlands would be protected. So our state needs to be protecting 97% of our wetlands. It's crucial. The second issue, once you get past the scope of the program, is the requirements for permits. And so those requirements need to be robust. They need to protect our waterways. They need to ensure we're avoiding impacts, we're minimizing them, and we're making sure that we mitigate them at the end of the day if we can't do the avoidance and minimization. And there's kind of two sub issues in here. So one of the good things about this program is that it recognizes that for kind of smaller projects, we want to streamline the permitting process. We do want this to be straightforward. We want those projects to be able to go forward without too much analysis. And we agreed to that. That's part of the compromise. But part of that compromise is that for those kind of what we call general authorizations, they have to have no more than minimal impacts. And that's important because if we don't ensure that there are only minimal impacts, we're going to end up having death by 1,000 cuts. So when you're thinking about permitting requirements for small projects, it's essential that we police that requirement, that they only have minimal impacts. And that's on the state. The state has to be analyzing those general authorizations to make sure that they're only having those minimal impacts. There's also a way for large projects to get what we call an individual authorization. This is for those projects that are going to have big impacts, that are going to have huge consequences for our state waters and wetlands. And so in that situation, there's a much more robust review. And again, the crucial point here is that for those projects, we have to think about avoidance first. Because when we talk about wetlands, they're incredibly difficult to replace, incredibly difficult to mitigate. So we need to avoid them in the first place. And the best way to do that is to require industry or whoever's coming in to get a permit to look at alternatives. So maybe they have a project in mind, but there might be an alternative with less impacts, a way to avoid some of these wetlands, a way to avoid some of these intermittent streams. And it's crucial that they go through that alternatives analysis and select the alternative that has the least impacts. That's critical to avoidance. What we're seeing in the rulemaking, though, is a lot of these industry groups don't want to do that work. They just want to plow ahead with their project and force it through. And so we need to hold really firm on that kind of do your alternatives and select the least environmentally damaging alternative. And then the third and last thing that I want to highlight is what's called the public interest review. So for every permit that's issued in Colorado, where we're going to be impacting state waters, we need to be asking questions like, is it really necessary to be degrading our waters? These are so important to us. What is this doing for the public interest? Is it contrary to the public interest? There are projects out there where if you degrade wetlands and fill them, you might be inundating downstream communities. That's a public interest concern that we need to be thinking about. There might be other situations where you're going to be having impacts to cultural sites or to crucial wildlife habitat or to the economy itself. Those are things that need to be taken into account in the permitting process so we kind of have a backstop at the end of the day to say, hey, look, this is not the right thing to be doing to our state waters. It's not in the public interest, and we need our our agencies to have that authority at the end of the day. So I know that's a lot of things to think about. I've tried to organize them into those three buckets for you. And, again, it's just crucial that you get your voice out there. So it may be that you can't go through these issues, but so long as you're there and speaking to the importance of these waters, what they mean to you, to your community, that's equally important, if not more important. So again, I really, really appreciate your time and interest and happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Stu, Josh, and Jennifer. Can I ask you all to get back on camera so we can do some questions from the audience? Awesome. Thank you. And thank you all again for your leadership and your work on this space. It's really made a big difference. Okay, so we're going to get started with the first question. Are minimal impacts well defined? And I'll let you all decide. Great. Take it away.
Certainly. Yes. So when we talk about minimal impacts, they have to, for these small projects, these general authorizations, they have to have individually minimal impacts for that project, but also cumulatively they have to be minimal. And there are guidelines in place for determining when an impact crosses that threshold from being minimal to something that's more significant. And a big issue in the rulemaking is that for these general authorizations, the division has to be doing the analysis. It has to be looking at the impacts to state waters so that it can know when we cross that threshold and we're no longer, a project can no longer access those general authorizations. So it's a great question.
Great. Thank you for that. Sorry, we have a lot of questions coming in. Let's go with the next one. Could these new rules limit outdoor recreation or angling?
I'm happy to jump in to get that conversation started. And the answer would be no. In fact, they would help support outdoor recreation, such as fishing and angling, because it's helping to protect the habitat that those species are dependent upon and ensuring these wetlands and streams are healthy as opposed to having pollution in them or other forms of impact, such as having utilities or something like that, um, impact those places.
Great. Thank you, Josh. I think also, Josh, going back to you, you touched on this a little bit, but just for the sake of making sure folks got that answer, what were the stakeholders that have been involved throughout the process? Would you mind repeating that?
Sure. So there have been dozens and dozens of stakeholders, but I'm going to kind of segment them into different industries. So obviously members of the conservation community have been involved, but then members from the agricultural community, so farmers and ranchers have been involved. Um, Cities and towns, municipalities, they've been involved. Oil and gas industry has been involved. The mining industry has been involved. Um, Water providers, so like Denver Water, Colorado Springs, utilities that provide our water supply, conservation districts like the Colorado River Conservation District or Northern Conservation Water District. Stu, who am I forgetting?
Oh, it's a lengthy list. You've got a lot there. Obviously, there's a lot of environmental groups as well that are engaged in the rulemaking. So that's key as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think folks should be aware that this is a priority for members of the conservation community. So, not only the organizations that are represented here tonight, but Audubon Society, Child Unlimited, um, and then some local watershed groups as well have been involved. And so, it's been a collective effort with a whole lot of organizations involved. And I'm hesitant to keep listing because I feel like I'm going to forget some organizations, and that's obviously not intentional.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Now, I do see a few folks are curious a little bit about counties and municipalities and their role, especially when it comes to the permits that, the state is reviewing, but also has impacts on water quality. So curious if you can touch a little bit of that. And this question follows up with, should should we also be petitioning our next level leaders?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question because um, one of the requirements in the rulemaking is that whenever the division is going to issue a permit, it has to consult with local governments. It has to get their, analysis of impacts, their concerns, um, as part of the permitting process. And there's, substantial deference granted to local governments as well, particularly if they have their own regulations in place to protect waterways from dredge and fill activities. So I think it's really important that we continue to build that local base that will provide a foundation for ensuring that your communities are protected. Obviously, that's not enough at the end of the day either. And that's just the nature of water. So a lot of our communities, at least in the Front Range, we are downstream of other communities that are higher up in the watershed. And so while it's important that you focus on your local community and your local governments, you also have to support the statewide approach because that's the way that you can really protect the entire watershed that may be outside of your community as well.
That's really great. Thank you, Stu. Another question coming down the pipeline. How can recent drilling leases released on a national level impact Colorado waters?
Well, certainly drilling is problematic from the perspective of waterways. The actual development of the drill pads, the roads to access them, all of that infrastructure may and often does require filling streams, wetlands, other resources. And there are some of those streamlined permits for oil and gas operations that I talked about where they have those minimal impacts. But if these are huge operations, it's important to think about the cumulative impact of all of them, and then they really should be analyzed under the individual permit category. There are also other risks that Jennifer alluded to, where you can have spills or you can have other releases of hazardous or toxic materials. That's more regulated under the discharge side of the water quality control program, not so much this dredge and fill side, but it's certainly a big concern there as well. And, you know, talking about it from the national level, we no longer have those federal protections in place. So it's important that the state of Colorado has its own framework in place to make sure those activities are protecting our waters, at least in this state.
Can I just add something too? Because I don't know if it'll come up or not. Is as wonderful of a job that we have done to restore protections here in Colorado, we are unable to restore the exact same level of protection that existed at the federal level before the Supreme Court's decision. Number one, we don't have the funding and staffing that is at the federal level. And then additionally, we don't have some of the protections, like the National Environmental Protection Act, or Policy Act, and we don't have like those protections, the Federal Endangered Species Act protections, and we don't have the ability to restore those federal protections. And so what we really do need, like as great as this law and this rule will be, the federal government needs to step up to ensure that like my kids and future generations are able to have clean, safe, affordable water. And it's the resources at the federal level that are going to allow for that to happen. So I just wanted to put that out there and doesn't come up later.
And I think just building on that as well, Josh, I think that's a terrific point and very true. But it also speaks to why it's so critical that we get a state program in place and that it is as protective as it can be because we are not going to be able to meet that federal level of protection. So we have to really make sure that we have every single requirement in place that we can get in place because we're already compromising. I think there was a question in there about how we're compromising. There's already been a huge compromise here in the loss of federal protections. And so that's why it's critical to ensure that this state program can do its very best job to fill that loss of protection.
Great. Thank you for that. And just really quickly, on that piece that you were talking on, like the limitations of the scope within our state, what are the resources, though, that Colorado will be providing to monitor and enforce that law that is passed and this regulation that is set? How will that piece of the work work?
I can
Go for
start
it.
and
Sure. Yep.
yeah. So this program is going to be paid for by those who are seeking the permits for the activities that they want to conduct, and that's going to help fund the program. And so that's really important because as folks may or may not be aware, Colorado's in a really, really tough like state budget situation. And so we need to ensure that there's adequate funding for this program to be successful. And so the fees from the permits are going to help pay for that. And then that in return helps the Department of Public Health, CDPHE, have the right staff in place to do the adequate review. I mean, I'll be honest, I think that that's going to be a challenge moving forward. And part of setting those fees is part of this hearing. And obviously, those who are going to be regulated would like to have the lowest fees possible. But then that's going to kind of starve the program from being able to have the right amount of staff who can do the proper amount of analysis to approve these permits and to put the right conditions in place to protect the water supply. Jennifer, Stu, you want to add?
No, I think that's great. I think part of it is the funding question. The other piece of it is really kind of the reporting side of affairs. So, a lot of this is going to come down to self-reporting. Um, the upside here is that we do have a very comprehensive program. So most everyone's going to know that they are subject to this program and they're going to come into the division to get their permit. It may be a streamlined permit, but they often still have to provide at least notice so that the division knows what's going on, that it can ensure folks are following the law. But, at the end of the day, it's also going to depend on us and on members of the public to be out there. And if you see something that looks suspicious or wrong, to reach out to CDPHE. I mean, they value that input, and hopefully they're responsive. But that's something we can also do to make sure that we're protecting our state waters because we do have the legal requirements in place. But it's about knowing what's happening as well. I definitely understand that.
Great. Thank you all again for all those incredible answers and for your time once more. And we are coming close to the hour, so I'm gonna answer one last question. And this is actually the perfect segue into my wrap up. So I am happy to take on this one. First of all, again, thank you all so much for taking the time for being here tonight and listening to these folks. And hopefully you're taking some new information and you feel like you've learned a few things. And now you know what's at stake for our wetlands, for our streams, for our water in general. So I just once again want to re-emphasize how crucial community voices will be in the success of establishing strong, long-lasting protections for our wetlands and streams. So you will see on their screen here a few opportunities to take action on this issue. First and foremost, I want to encourage you all. We will link a petition on the chat right now. I want to encourage everybody to take 2 minutes right now to do that because it's a very easy and effective way of supporting strong rules for this. And then also want to really encourage, I saw a few questions referring to what's the most, powerful thing I can do. Is sending a comment the most important thing to do? The right answer from my perspective is the most impactful action you can take is to show up to the hearing on December 8th at 10 a.m. and give verbal testimony to the commissioners. But, we of course recognize that's a tricky time. So if that absolutely doesn't work out, you can still send a written comment to the commission. And we linked both the email address that you can send written comments to and the link to register for public comment during the hearing. I will also be following up tomorrow via email with all of you with those resources, and then to some folks' questions about having resources to draft those comments and like more information to come up with those comments. We'll be sure to also provide that for you all. And again, I will put this on my email tomorrow, but if you're interested, if you feel passionate and just want a little bit more support in drafting a comment and, sort of strategizing to be able to give that public testimony, just respond to that email and I would be happy to work with you and get you prepared for that. So thank you again all so much for joining us tonight. 6:59, so perfect timing. Thank you, Stu, Jennifer, Josh, Kelly, Speaker McCluskie, Representative McCormick. Really appreciate your time, and I hope you all have a wonderful night. Thanks, everybody.